There was a time when a man's word meant something, when a promise made at the altar was a promise kept until the day he was buried. But what happened on Family Feud last Wednesday afternoon would prove that some men spend their entire lives building a beautiful house on top of a grave, and that sooner or later, the ground always opens up. When the small voice came across the studio speaker, when the words registered in Steve Harvey's ears, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes did something nobody in that audience had ever seen him do. He froze, completely. For 9 full seconds, Steve Harvey did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. He just stood there in the middle of that bright stage, holding a card he was no longer reading, looking at a man whose entire life was about to be torn apart in front of a national television audience. Carol Mitchell was 54 years old. She had been married to her husband Robert for 31 years. She had 3 grown children, 4 grandchildren, a small house in suburban Ohio, and a quiet life she had spent decades carefully building. She did not know, when she walked onto that Family Feud stage in her best pink blouse, that the next 12 minutes would erase every single thing she thought she knew about the man standing next to her. She did not know that a young woman she had never met, sitting in the third row of the studio audience, was about to stand up and say 6 words that would freeze Steve Harvey in his tracks. This is the kind of story that you do not forget, the kind that makes you call your father, call your husband, call your brother, just to remind them that the truth always finds its way home, even when it takes 31 years, and that there is no secret in this world strong enough to stay buried forever. Carol Mitchell had grown up on a farm outside Dayton, Ohio. She was the youngest of 4 children, the only girl, and her mother had raised her to believe that family was the most important thing in the world. Her father had been a quiet, hard-working man who milked cows at 4 in the morning and prayed before every meal. Her mother had baked bread every Saturday, made Sunday dinner for 14 people every week, and sang in the church choir for 46 years. Carol had grown up surrounded by the sound of family, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen sink, the slam of the screen door, the murmur of her brothers arguing about football in the next room. She had wanted, from the time she was very small, to build a family of her own that sounded just like that. She met Robert Mitchell when she was 22. He was a young man fresh out of the Air Force, working as a manager at a local auto parts store. And he had a steady job, a clean record, and a charming smile. Carol's father liked him. Carol's mother liked him even more. He came to Sunday dinner 3 weeks in a row before he ever asked Carol on a proper date, and her brothers had teased her relentlessly about it. They were married 18 months later, in the same little country church where Carol's parents had been married 30 years before. Carol wore her mother's wedding dress. Her father walked her down the aisle. Robert promised her, in front of 200 friends and family members, that he would love her and honor her and be faithful to her until the day he died. The early years of their marriage were happy ones. Robert worked his way up at the auto parts store, eventually becoming a regional manager, traveling to different stores across 3 states to handle problems and train. Staff Carol worked as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm in town. She kept the books neat and organized. She got along with everyone. She came home every evening at 5:30 and made dinner. They had 3 children together, James first, then David, then their daughter Sarah. Carol stopped working when James was born. She wanted to be home with her children the way her own mother had been home with her rice. Bert agreed. Robert said it was the right thing to do. The years went by. The children grew up. James went to college, then to law school. David went into the Marines, served 2 tours, came home with a slight limp and a quiet kind of strength. Sarah became a nurse, married a good man, had 2 daughters of her own. Carol's life filled up with small joys. Grandchildren on her lap on Sunday afternoons. Her own mother in her 80s now, still calling every Wednesday to talk about the weather. Her garden in the backyard, where she grew tomatoes and beans and zucchini every summer. Her women's group at the church, where she had been a member for 28 years. But Robert had been changing for a long time. Carol had noticed it, the way a wife notices small things over many years. The travel had increased over the decades. Robert was on the road 3 weeks out of every 4 by the time they had been. Married 15 years, he had bought a second cell phone for business. He said he had started keeping a separate bank account for business expenses, he said. He had stopped wearing his wedding ring on certain trips because it made him look too settled when he was negotiating with younger vendors. He said Carol had accepted all of these explanations. She had been raised to trust her husband. She had been raised to believe that questioning a man's word was the beginning of the end of a marriage. But there had been a about 7 years before the Family Feud taping, when Carol had answered the phone on the second ring, and a young woman's voice had asked for Robert by name. The young woman had sounded confused. She had said, "Is this the right number for Robert Mitchell?" Carol had said, "Yes, this is his wife." There had been a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the young woman had said, "I am sorry, I have the wrong number," and she had hung up. Carol had held the phone in her hand for almost a minute. She had thought about it for the rest of the evening. When Robert came home from his trip 3 days later, she had asked him, very gently, if he knew a young woman who might have been trying to reach him. Robert had laughed. He had told her she was being silly. He had told her that probably some young secretary at one of the stores had dialed the wrong number. Carol had let it go. Carol had let many things go over many years. 3 months before the Family Feud taping, Carol's youngest daughter, Sarah, had filled out the application as a birthday surprise for her mother. Carol had always loved the show. She had watched it for decades. Steve Harvey was her favorite host. She loved the way he looked at the contestants. She loved the way he hugged the older women. She loved the way he could turn a tense moment into a laugh just by raising one eyebrow. When the producers called and said the Mitchell family had been selected, Carol had cried. Her 3 grown children had agreed to come on the show with her. Robert had agreed too, though he had seemed less enthusiastic about it than the rest of the family. Robert had asked, more than once, if there was any way to find out which episode would air, and when, and how the audience was selected. Carol had thought it was a strange thing to be curious about. She had not understood until much later why he had been asking. What Carol did not know, what nobody in the family knew, was that there was a young woman in Cincinnati named Rachel who had been searching for her father for the last 6 years. Rachel was 28 years old. She had grown up believing her father had died when she was a baby. Her mother had told her that for her entire life. But 2 years earlier, on her mother's deathbed, Rachel had learned the truth. Her father was not dead. Her father had a whole other family. Her father was a man named Robert Mitchell who lived in Ohio with a wife and 3 children who did not know Rachel existed. Rachel had spent the next 2 years finding him, researching him, seeing him from a distance. And when she had seen the announcement that the Mitchell family was going to be on Family Feud, she had bought a ticket to the studio audience that very same day. The taping took place on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. The Mitchell family lined up on their side of the stage. Robert stood at the podium first, in a navy blue suit that Carol had picked out for him the week before. Carol stood next to him in her best pink blouse, her hair freshly set at the salon that morning. James was next to Carol. David was next to James. Sarah was at the end of the line, smiling and waving at the camera. More excited than anyone else in the family, they were facing off against the Williams family from Atlanta, a warm and lively group of 5 who had been making jokes and laughing since they walked onto the stage. Steve Harvey came out to his usual roar of applause. He worked the crowd. He cracked his jokes. He shook hands down both lines of contestants. When he got to Carol, he paused. He always paused with the soft-spoken ones. He looked at her pink blouse and her gentle face and her hands folded politely on the podium, and he said, "Ma'am, you look like the kind of woman who has fed an army of grandchildren in her time." Carol laughed, a real warm laugh, and said, "4 of them, Mr. Harvey, and they eat like wolves." Steve laughed with her. He patted her hand. He moved on down the line. He stopped briefly in front of Robert. He shook Robert's hand. He said something polite. He moved on. He did not know at that moment that Robert Mitchell would barely speak another word for the rest of the day. The first round began. Steve read the question. "We surveyed 100 people. Name something a grandmother is famous for in her family." James buzzed in first. "Her cooking," he said. The board lit up. It was the #1 answer for 43 points. The audience clapped. The Mitchells were off to a strong start. Sarah took the next answer. Carol took the one after that. The family was working together beautifully, the way Sarah had hoped they would, with everyone laughing and high-fiving each other between answers. Robert stood at his podium with a tight smile. He had not buzzed in once. Round 2 began. "Name something you do at a family reunion." Carol buzzed in this time. "Eat too much food," she said. The audience laughed. Steve laughed with her. The board lit up. #2 answer for 26 points. Carol blushed. She was clearly enjoying herself. Sarah was beaming at her mother from the other end of the podium. James and David were grinning. Even Robert was nodding along, though Carol noticed that he kept glancing out at the audience, scanning the rows of faces with a strange intensity, as if he were looking for someone. Round 3 began. This was when everything started to change. Steve Harvey read the question. And as he read it, he did the thing he always did. The warm smile, the leaned-in stance, the easy lead-in. "We surveyed 100 people," he said. "Name a secret that a husband might keep from his wife." The audience laughed. They expected the same thing they always expected. Small, harmless, light-hearted answers. The cost of his fishing rod, a dent in the car, the score of the football game he had recorded for her. Robert laughed too, but it was a thin laugh, and Carol noticed that his hands had tightened on the edge of the podium. The buzzer went off. It was James, the oldest son, the lawyer. He was smiling. "How much he spent on his golf clubs," James said. Steve grinned. "Good answer, son," he said. The board lit up. Number 3 answer for 19 points. The audience clapped. The Mitchells continued their run. David got the next answer, his Christmas bonus, which was the number 5 answer for 11 points. Sarah got the one after that. Carol got the next one. The family was racking up the points. They were heading toward the win. And then, just as Steve was about to read the final answer card, something happened that nobody had expected. From the third row of the studio audience, a young woman stood up. She was 28 years old, with dark brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a gray sweater and jeans. She was holding a piece of paper in her hand. The cameras did not catch her at first. The producers in the booth caught her first, and one of them started waving frantically at the floor crew. But before anyone could stop her, before security could even reach her row, the young woman spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was clear and steady, and it carried through the entire studio because the entire studio had gone quiet to hear it. "Mr. Harvey," she said, "I am his daughter." The studio froze. The producers froze. The camera operators froze. The contestants on both sides of the stage froze. Steve Harvey, who had been about to read the final answer, froze with the card halfway to his mouth. He did not move. He did not lower the card. He did not turn his head. He just stepped the way a man stops when the ground beneath his feet has suddenly become uncertain. The young woman was not finished. She held up the piece of paper in her hand. "My name is Rachel Anderson," she said. "I am 28 years old. The man standing at that podium in the navy blue suit is my biological father. His name is on my birth certificate. I have a DNA test that confirms it. He has known about me for 28 years. He has paid my mother to keep me a secret for 28 years. My mother died 2 years ago, and that is when I found out the truth. I have spent 2 years trying to figure out how to tell his family without destroying their lives. But 3 days ago I realized that the lie has already destroyed their lives. They just do not know it yet." Carol Mitchell did not move. She did not turn her head. She did not look at her husband. She just stood at her podium with her hand frozen on the wood, looking at the young woman in the audience. James, the oldest son, had taken a half step away from the line, his lawyer's brain trying to process what was happening. David, the Marine, had gone completely still in the way a soldier goes still when something dangerous is in the room. Sarah, the youngest, was already crying, but the tears were silent. She had not made a sound. Robert Mitchell had gone the color of cold ash. He was trying to speak. He was making small noises, the kind of noises a man makes when he is trying to find the right lie and cannot find one fast enough. He looked at Carol. He looked at his children. He looked at Steve Harvey. He looked at the young woman in the audience. His mouth was opening and closing. No words were coming out, and Steve Harvey was still frozen. 9 full seconds had now passed since Rachel Anderson had stood up. Steve had not moved. The card was still in his hand, still halfway to his mouth. The audience was completely silent. You could hear the faint hum of the studio lights. You could hear someone in the back of the audience clear their throat. You could hear Carol Mitchell's breathing, slow and shallow and a little unsteady, the breathing of a woman whose entire world had just rearranged itself in front of 200 strangers. Steve Harvey finally moved. He lowered the card slowly. He looked at it for a long moment, as if he had never seen a piece of paper before in his life. Then he set it down on the floor at his feet. He turned to look at Robert Mitchell. He did not say anything for a long moment. The silence in the studio was its own kind of sound now. It was heavy. It was thick. It was the sound of 200 people waiting to see what Steve Harvey was going to do. When Steve finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "I want you to look at me." Robert Mitchell did not look at him. Robert was still staring at his feet. Steve said it again, a little louder. "Mr. Mitchell, look at me." Robert finally looked up. His eyes were wet. But Steve Harvey had been on television long enough to know the difference between a man crying because he was sorry and a man crying because he had been caught. Robert Mitchell was crying because he had been caught. Steve turned away from him. He could not look at him anymore. He turned toward the audience. He looked at Rachel Anderson, the young woman still standing in the third row, the piece of paper still in her trembling hand. "Sweetheart," Steve said, "come down here." Rachel hesitated. The producers were still trying to figure out what to do. A security guard had reached her row and was standing next to her, but he was not sure whether to escort her out or escort her down. Steve Harvey made the decision for everyone. "Sweetheart," he said again, more gently, "come down here. It is okay. You came a long way to say what you said. Come down here so I can shake your hand." Rachel walked down the aisle. The audience parted for her. She walked up the small set of steps and onto the stage, and Steve Harvey met her at the top of the stairs and took her hand. He held it the same way he had held Carol's hand. A few minutes earlier, he did not let go. He walked her over toward the Mitchell family, but he did not bring her all the way. He stopped about 10 feet away from Carol's podium, because Steve Harvey had been doing this long enough to know that some things have to happen at the right pace, and you cannot rush a woman who has just had her whole life rewritten in front of her. Steve turned to Carol. "Mistress Mitchell," he said. Carol looked at him. Her eyes were dry somehow. She had not cried. She was the only person in that family who had not cried. She looked at Steve with the steady, patient gaze of a woman who had spent her whole life waiting for a moment she had not known was coming. And now that it had come, she was not going to look away from it. "Mr. Harvey," she said. Her voice was even. "Could I, please? Could I have a moment to speak to that young lady?" Steve nodded. "Take all the time you need, Mistress Mitchell," he said. Carol stepped out from behind her podium. She walked slowly across the stage. She did not look at Robert as she passed him. She walked all the way over to where Rachel was standing with Steve. She stopped about 3 feet away. She looked at Rachel for a long moment, the way a mother looks at a child who has been hurt. Then she said very quietly, "Sweetheart, what is your full name?" Rachel said, "Rachel Marie Anderson." Carol nodded. Carol said, "When is your birthday?" Rachel said, "March 14th, 1996. Carol nodded again. She had been doing the math in her head. March 14th, 1996 was 8 months after Carol had given birth to her own daughter, Sarah. Carol turned and looked at Robert for the first time since the young woman had stood up. She did not say anything to him. She just looked at him. And whatever was on her face, it was something Robert Mitchell had never seen there before. Carol turned back to Rachel. "Sweetheart," she said, "I am very sorry. I am very, very sorry that you had to grow up the way you did. I am very sorry that your mother passed away. I am very sorry that you had to find this out by yourself, with no one to help you. I am very sorry that you had to do what you just did, in front of all these people, just to be heard." Rachel was crying now. Rachel had not cried when she was speaking. She was crying now. Carol reached out very carefully and put her hand on Rachel's cheek. She wiped a tear away with her thumb. "None of this is your fault, sweetheart," Carol said. "Do you hear me? None of this is your fault. You did not ask to be born into a lie. You did not ask to be kept a secret. You did the right thing today. The hardest thing, but the right thing." The audience erupted. 200 people stood up at once. They were applauding. They were crying. They were shouting things at Robert Mitchell, who was now openly weeping at his podium alone, with no one on his side of the stage. James, the oldest son, had walked off his side of the podium and was standing with his mother. David the Marine was right behind him. Sarah, the youngest, was already on her way over, her face red with tears. The Mitchell family had reformed itself. On the other side of the stage, around Carol and around Rachel, with no one standing next to Robert Mitchell except his own shadow. Steve Harvey ended the taping right there. "We are done," he said into the microphone. "We are not finishing this show. The Williams family, I am so sorry. We are going to bring you all back another day, and you will get a real game and a real check, I promise you that. But today, this stage belongs to the truth. Today, this stage belongs to a young woman who walked 28 years to get here, and a wife who deserved better than what she got. Today, this stage does not belong to a man in a navy blue suit who thought he could keep a secret forever." He turned to the cameras. He looked directly into the lens. "The truth always comes home, ladies and gentlemen," he said. "It might take 28 years. It might take 50. But the truth always comes home. And when it does, you better hope you're on the right side of it." Steve walked Carol and Rachel off the stage himself. He kept their hands in his the whole way. Carol's 3 grown children walked behind them. Robert Mitchell was left alone on the stage with the producers and the May security team. He sat in a green room by himself for 2 hours. Nobody came to talk to him. His own children would not see him. Carol would not see him. Rachel did not want to see him. When he was finally released, a security guard walked him to his rental car. He drove back to the hotel alone. He flew home to Ohio alone the next morning. The house was empty when he arrived. Carol had not come home. Carol had gone to her daughter Sarah's house instead. Carol would never come home again. The episode never aired. The network and the producers agreed it would not be appropriate. But the story spread anyway. 200 people had been in that audience, and within a week, the story was everywhere. Newspapers ran it. Morning shows discussed it. Commentators argued about whether Rachel had done the right thing by speaking up the way she did. Most people said yes. Most people said it was the bravest thing they had ever heard of a young woman doing on national television. Carol filed for divorce within 10 days. Her son James, the lawyer, handled the case himself. The divorce was not contested. Robert had no defense. Robert had been paying Rachel's mother $1,200 a month, every month, for 28 years, out of a separate bank account Carol had never known existed. The total amount was over $400,000. The court ruled that this money should have been part of the marital assets, and Carol was awarded a settlement that took everything Robert had saved over 31 years of marriage. Robert lost the house. He lost his retirement. He lost his pension. He lost his job eventually. When his employer learned about the situation, he moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and his 3 grown children stopped speaking to him entirely. Carol and Rachel began a relationship, slowly, carefully, the way 2 people begin something that has to be earned rather than assumed. They met for coffee 3 weeks after the taping, then again 2 weeks after that. By Christmas, Rachel had been invited to Sarah's house for dinner. James and David came too. They were not sure what to do at first. This woman who was technically their half-sister, this woman who had grown up not knowing them. But Rachel was kind. Rachel was patient. Rachel had grown up alone, and she did not push too fast. By the following summer, Rachel was a regular at Sunday dinners at Carol's new house. Carol's grandchildren called her Aunt Rachel. They did not understand the details yet. They were too young, but I knew that Aunt Rachel was family, and that was enough. Steve Harvey kept in touch. He called Carol on her birthday every year. He sent flowers when Sarah had her 3rd baby. He invited Carol and Rachel to be guests on his daytime show, where he introduced them to the audience as one of the most remarkable pairs of women he had ever met. The 2 of them sat on the couch next to him, holding hands, and they told their story together. Millions of women watched it and called their own mothers and their own daughters and their own sisters, just to remind them they were loved. Carol Mitchell is 61 years old now. She lives in a small 2-bedroom house with a garden in the backyard, where she still grows tomatoes and beans and zucchini every summer. She has 4 grandchildren of her own, and 2 more, technically, that she has chosen to claim. She tells her grandchildren, when they are old enough to understand, that family is the most important thing in the world, but family has to be built on the truth, because anything built on a lie will eventually fall down. And every now and then, when she is sitting on her front porch in the evening, she thinks about a man with a shaved head and kind eyes who once froze for 9 full seconds in the middle of a game show, and she smiles. Because some heroes do not need to say anything at all. Sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do is stop and listen and let the truth come home.